Gowda.
Deputy Chairman, sir, thank you for the opportunity to initiate the discussion on the Regional Rural Banks Bill, Amendments Bill 2014. So as you know, the news from rural India has not been very encouraging recently. There have been unseasonal rains, there have been farmer suicides, there have been all kinds of stories of distress. But within that rather bleak landscape, regional rural banks are a bright spot. The Junior Finance Minister has just mentioned the extraordinary reach and penetration of regional rural banks, the kind of work that they're doing in terms of financial inclusion across rural India. When we think and talk about regional rural banks, our minds and hearts go back to Srimati Indira Gandhi, who set up regional rural banks on Gandhi Jayanti Day in 1975. Her plan was to ensure that rural India gets access to credit from sources other than the rural cooperatives and other banks that existed at that time. The structure, as Mr. Sinha has just pointed out, is 50% ownership by the Government of India, 15% ownership by state governments, and 35% ownership by sponsor banks. So, that far-sighted move of Indira Gandhi is being continued by numerous governments that have followed ever since. Financial inclusion has been the central agenda with an aim to ensure that the financial net, that credit, that access to varieties of financial services are available to our rural brothers and sisters. Today, rural India's financial inclusion landscape is abuzz. You have banking correspondents, you have new bank branches, you have microfinance institutions. The post office is expanding its operations, and along with the kind of work that we had done as part of the UPA to increase bank penetration to every village which had 2,000 population, today the NDA government has taken the Jan Dhan Yojana forward, which is ensuring that every individual also gets access to a bank account. The old initiative to establish rural roads, Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana, that we expanded under the UPA, and that is allowing horticulture, animal husbandry, various kinds of market-connected products to reach the market, and rural prosperity has grown substantially over the last decade. It is one of the facts that we have not paid enough attention to in the last few years, but that has been one of the sterling achievements of the UPA government. So, as Mr. Jayant Sinha just pointed out, regional rural banks are a unique set of financial players in rural India. If I may say something, a way of describing them, I would call them the true sons of the soil. They have an extraordinary connect with the ground, and if you look at their performance in rural India, you will see that 31% of the deposit accounts of scheduled commercial banks, Indian scheduled commercial banks, belong to the RRBs, 37% of offices, 37% of all loan accounts are also those that accrue to the rural regional banks. So, even more importantly, there are many areas of India where farming families are excluded from the financial sector, especially in the northeast, etc. In those areas, you'll see that the regional rural banks have a very significant presence. 34% of the branches in northeast, 30% in the east, and 32% in central India are regional rural banks. These are historically underbanked areas. Further, more than 40% of the share of self-help group linkage is a thrust that regional rural banks have been able to accomplish. So while many regional rural banks have done well, some others have not. And in those cases, the government in the past has ushered in a scheme of mergers and acquisitions, which has ensured that the banking sector in this domain has got strengthened. Today, 196 regional rural banks are now down to 56 healthy regional rural banks across 27 states. These, according to the Rangarajan report, a committee report of 2008, these banks now have the critical mass to be financially viable and successful. And to add to that base, you have the government, Mr. Jaitley in his latest budget announced 15,000 crores of RRB refinancing funds. So those will provide additional strength and support to RRBs as they pursue their mission going forward. So while all this is a positive, rosy picture, there are many aspects where RRBs require strengthening. There are areas where things have not worked that well. And the first point I want to bring to the attention of the House and through you to the Minister is the issue of sponsor banks. The idea of the sponsor bank was a very good idea. These were young, new initiatives. They needed the guidance from established banking institutions. And the idea was that for 5 years, they would help these regional rural banks get up to speed, go out there and do their job. But that umbilical cord has never been cut. And essentially, the sponsor banks have remained in a position whereby they can continue to have a very strong effect on the decisions, the decision-making, the operations of regional rural banks. So I think the sponsor bank feature has outlived its utility. I think my impression is that the relationship between the sponsor bank and the regional rural bank is not anymore that of a sponsor, but that of a competitor. In fact, that of a stepmother, with no negative allusions to stepmothers, but I'm talking in a figure of speech manner. So, when you think about what has happened to regional rural banks, sponsor banks have often used them as a source of funds which come out of rural India and then get transferred to various other activities and investments elsewhere. That is not the purpose for which these banks were established, and therefore these kinds of actions of the sponsor banks need to be remedied. Many sponsor bank staff see posting in RRBs as a punishment posting. That does not augur well for the morale of those who work hard on the ground, and that does not certainly ensure more efficient and effective service. It is time that the government brings about an amicable separation between RRBs and sponsor banks. In this bill, there are provisions in terms of the allocation of shares which ensure that 35% that sponsor banks currently hold can be brought down to as low as 1% in order to meet the 51% target of state, center, and sponsor bank holdings. That would yield a huge 49% share, which could then be sold through IPOs, through auctions, through a variety of other measures of tapping financial markets. So the finance minister and the junior finance minister know about a concept called impact investors. There are numerous institutions around the world and in India who are very keen on investing not in highly commercialized sectors, but in sectors where there is a significant impact on poverty, on underbanked areas. And I would urge them to ensure that impact investors are given a chance to take over the shareholdings of sponsor banks and bring in their expertise, their concern for the poor, and enhance the capability of regional rural banks. Along with that, to make such a change happen, we may need to change the umbrella governance structure for this sector. Just like we have a NABARD in the case of rural credit, we may need a similar umbrella structure. That is also entirely possible under the details of how this bill will be actually implemented. So, when we think about, the counter argument may be that the RBI is allowing numerous new institutions to enter. You have payments banks, you have small banks, you have a whole variety of new kinds of players operating in rural India. But regional rural banks are a strong and unique player. They have tremendous geographic focus. They have tremendous depth in terms of their ability to penetrate rural India, and we should not lose that capacity that they have built over the years. So a second point I would like to highlight is the need for autonomy and professionalization. In the budget speech, Mr. Jaitley already has pointed out that PSBs, public sector banks, will get more autonomy in their choice, in the ways in which they get to choose their chairman, in a variety of other ways as well. We need similar autonomy for regional rural banks also. We need to ensure that the government does not tie the hands of these institutions through varieties of interest rate caps, etc. And even the RBI can be persuaded to not apply the rates of interest requirements, the statutory lending requirements, SLR rates and others, so that this particular set of organizations, the RRBs, which are going out and performing a stellar yeoman service to the country, can actually lend at lower rates of interest. So third is about management. Again, I already mentioned that the top management comes from sponsor banks and they have not been doing justice to these organizations. We need to turn that around. We need to ensure that regional rural banks become a choice posting, especially for those who want to prove their capability as they move up the career ladders. Let possibilities be created for people to come here on deputations and create autonomous boards here as well with professionals, with expertise, strengthen the governance and the accountability of various players to the Regional Rural Bank Board. If you make these reforms and put them in place first, before reaching out to investors, you will reap a benefit, reap a harvest, which will make every farmer, every banker proud. So finally, I'd like to lay out a set of directions for regional rural banks going forward. We can think of them as not as small banks or payments banks or something else, but as policy banks. We have always had this thrust of a policy aimed at the priority sector, agriculture, rural India. But if you see how that priority sector is actually working out, you will see that there is a lot of fudging, there is a lot of mislabeling. Just, this is the sort of reality on the ground. When you have entities that have that kind of connect and reach, let us use them as the vehicles for priority sector, for lending, for priority sector financing. So let these RRBs come up with products of their own and price them accordingly. That is the kind of leeway the government needs to give. Already in the context of microfinance, we have seen that people are willing to pay much more for a reliable source of credit in a timely manner. So let these RRBs go out there and penetrate the communities, and let us use them also as vehicles for the delivery of a variety of financial services that are now beginning to become a reality in rural India. Today with Aadhaar, you can send subsidies into people's bank accounts. Let us use RRBs as a vehicle for that. Let us use them, RRBs, as a vehicle for the pensions and for the insurance schemes that Mr. Jaitley promised us in his budget, which take the concept of financial inclusion much more further than we have already done. RRBs also have the capacity to do self-help group organization, to do joint liability group organization. Those are unique skills that will enable them to ensure that loans are also paid back in a much more community-supported manner, and that would really make a difference. So another aspect when we're thinking about selling the stake is to think about how we can involve village panchayats. Every village where a regional rural bank has an office could also somehow be made a stakeholder in that bank. Not only will that give the village a stake in the success of the bank and a chance to partake of its dividends and other profits, it would also ensure that this ability to include investors from a variety of sources goes down to the heart of rural India. This is something, the mechanics of this will need to be explored, but it is something that I would urge the government to pay attention to. So, there is a phrase, diamonds in the rough. Regional rural banks are diamonds in the rough. And if India is known for anything, if the state of Gujarat is known for anything, it is for our diamond cutting and polishing industry. I urge the government to take regional rural banks, which are diamonds in the rough, apply their advanced capabilities of polishing and cutting, and ensure that these financial institutions shine and make a huge difference to financial inclusion and to every one of our rural brothers and sisters. Thank you, sir.
Very good. Very good.